In the 8th and 9th centuries, there was a tendency among solitary contemplatives in Ireland and Scotland to band together in groups of 13, suggestive of Christ and his 12 apostles. These, known as culdees, Irish Celidé, meaning companions, were at times fiercely critical of other communities and violently antagonistic to women. The reasons for this were probably more psychological than theological. A fear of sex and of sexuality in general does not seem to have been a usual feature of the Church in the British Isles before the time of Augustine of Canterbury. Celibacy seems to have been a state entered into for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, as a man or woman's sense of vocation required. That the clergy should be celibate of necessity seems not to have been an issue. In the Mediterranean world it was somewhat different. In the first place, there had been a number of powerfully world-denying and falsely spiritualizing influences from such movements as Gnosticism and Manichaeism, from whose influence these islands seem to have escaped almost completely. Manichaeism taught that particles of light had been stolen from heaven by Satan and imprisoned in the human brain. The whole purpose of religion was to release these particles back into the light. Asceticism and world rejection featured strongly in the movement, and it shared with certain of the manifestations of Gnosticism, literally esoteric knowledgeism, an abhorrence of the flesh. In addition, there was a growing tradition of asceticism in the Mediterranean world, some of it pathological, and there was also the strongly celibate influence of the Desert Fathers. The Council of Nicaea in 325 rejected a proposition that clergy should give up cohabitation with their wives. A number of councils in the East specifically upheld the right of clergy to marry, and the Council of Trullo, named after the Trullus, or domed hall, in the palace of Emperor Justinian II in Constantinople, in 692 finalized the matter. The Christian East has ever since chosen its bishops from those in monastic vows, but other clergy are free to marry before their ordination, though not after it. In the West there was clearly a growing climate of opinion in favor of clerical celibacy, and attempts were made to enforce it as early as the Council of Elvira in 306. The inference was that the clergy ought to renounce marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The clergy were in the process of becoming separated from the great body of the faithful. Clericalism was taking hold, however unconsciously. The clergy were to be an elite, a caste. Into this somewhat obsessed Western Mediterranean climate was born at Carthage in 354, to a pagan father and a Christian mother, a child who was to grow up into one of the towering intellects of the Western Church. His influence for both good and ill was to be far-reaching and long-lasting. The personal psychology of St. Augustine of Hippo, for as such the Church knows him, is, I suggest, the root cause of our search for a more authentic experience of the Christian gospel in Celtic Christianity and the Celtic Church. Augustine of Hippo. There in heaven we shall rest and we shall see. We shall see and we shall love. We shall love and we shall praise. Behold what shall be in the end and shall not end. St. Augustine of Hippo. St. Augustine of Hippo, some of whose words head this section, was a great man and a holy man to whom we are profoundly indebted, but like any other man he was flawed. He was also tormented. His deep psychological problems colored his theology, and his torment-darkened theology was to have a profound effect upon the thinking processes of the whole Western Church. The effects are still with us today. Augustine received a Christian education, but was not baptized into the faith, which he in any case abandoned at university. At the same time he took a mistress who remained faithful to him for 15 years and bore him a son, a Deodatus. Augustine then became a Manichaean and moved first to Rome and then to Milan, where he lectured in rhetoric. At Milan, Augustine came under the influence of its bishop, Ambrose. He began to feel not only drawn back to the Christian faith, which he had since abandoned, but also to a life of monasticism, of which Ambrose was a powerful advocate. In 386 he dismissed his faithful mistress, who returned to Africa broken-hearted. The following year he was baptized, and in 388 he returned to Africa and established a monastery at Tagaste. He was ordained priest in 391 and consecrated bishop in 395. Augustine was intellectually brilliant. It was perhaps the intellectual in him which defined faith as intellectual assent, in spite of the Epistle to the Hebrews, which says, "Faith gives assurance to our hopes, and makes us certain of realities we do not see." He was widely educated, ardent and gifted with mystical insight, but he was also flawed. He was able to specifically deny, in defiance of Scripture, that women were made in the image and likeness of God. Augustine was tormented with guilt, and his torment centered upon his own sexuality. It is easy for us to psychologize Augustine now, but it was impossible for him at that time. In his teachings he specifically identified sex with sin, but it was the controversy stirred up by the Briton, Pelagius, which was to provoke his most despairing and damaging outpourings. Augustine interpreted the story of Adam and Eve quite literally. He saw the unfallen Adam as endowed with all possible wisdom and knowledge. As a result of Adam's disobedience, however, these attributes were entirely lost, and henceforth, in Augustine's view, mankind suffers from a hereditary moral disease, sexually transmitted, as a result of which he is under a harsh necessity of committing sin. In Augustine's view, not only is there an original sin, but there is a continuing liability of original guilt that goes with it. Augustine saw the whole human race as a massa peccati, a mass of sin, out of which God elects some fortunate souls to receive his quite unmerited mercy. He believed that infants dying unbaptized go to everlasting perdition. His guilt-ridden vision is characterized by an extreme pessimism on the one hand, and a wonder at the mercy of God and of the workings of his grace on the other. Augustine was obliged to develop such complex theories about the workings of God's grace that, when I wrestled with them as a theological student, I found myself hoping that God understood them and was managing to do all the right things. There was a streak of cruelty in Augustine, discernible in many of his writings, and that his theology was psychologically conditioned is so obvious now that it hardly needs to be stated. At times it comes close to the pathological. It has been the great misfortune of the Western Church ever since that, at the time, the climate was ripe for its extensive, though never quite complete adoption. Fortunately, this tormented soul, whom the shallow-thinking Pelagius goaded into articulating such essentially unscriptural theological darkness, was not by any means all darkness within. In his Confessio, perhaps the first ever autobiography, and thus perhaps indicative of a deep unconscious need to justify himself, he addressed God in words which are as true for every other human being as they are for himself. "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee." The doctrine of original sin. "There is a youth comes wooing me, O King of Kings, may he succeed. Would he were stretched upon my breast, with his body against my skin." Isabel, Countess of Argyll, 15th century. With a growing exaltation of celibacy as the proper state for a spiritual elite, an increasing clericalization of the Western Church, a concentration of power identified with authority at Rome, and the Pope assuming a spiritualized version of the imperial mantle, it is little wonder that the teachings of Augustine of Hippo found largely uncritical favor. Pope Leo the Great, 440 to 461, forbade married men to put away their wives upon ordination, but decreed that they were henceforth to live with them as brother and sister. Sex was too innately sinful to have anything to do with love, or for clergymen to so much as contemplate, even with their wives. This was the background to Augustine of Canterbury's 8th question, and the 9th which followed it. And this was also the background against which Gregory's reply must be understood. An all-male teaching authority in the Church, celibate by compulsion, and brought up to regard sex as sin, could only regard woman as a threat. All the makings of a grotesque and, tragically, largely unconscious, distortion of the gospel and of its implications were thus to hand. Henceforth there was always the danger of a schizoid separation of religion from life. Sexuality was now a subject quite unsuitable for prayer, other than in groveling repentance with a sense of perpetual guilt. The early 15th century prayer by Isabel, Countess of Argyll, to our Lord, the King of Kings, quoted at the head of this section, was either the prayer of a blasphemer or that of a perfectly normal Celtic woman in love. Perhaps most sadly of all, clerical concubinage, with all its degradation, both of women in general and of the men who practiced it, was to be a more or less winked-at perpetual scandal throughout the subsequent history of the Western Church. We cannot be sure what the attitude of the British Church had been to these matters, nor can we be sure of the attitude of the Church in Ireland, which was founded somewhat later. Links between Britain and the continent were strong, but the various Mediterranean controversies passed these North Atlantic islands by. Perhaps the reaction of the Briton Pelagius to what he regarded as dehumanizing in Augustine's Confessio may give us some indication. But Pelagius went, or more probably was driven, much too far in his arguments, and was himself quite properly condemned for them. The real mischief of Augustine's distorted vision, and its too ready acceptance at Rome, was that he succeeded in removing the Church's gaze from the blessed creation, which God created good, and which is the transfigured image of its Creator. Henceforth it would be fixed instead upon Adam's fall, and the doctrine of original sin. Henceforth, the whole interpretation of the gospel began with original sin, and not infrequently with the idea of transmitted guilt as well. The blessed creation slowly and inexorably began to be pushed to the outer fringes of Western theological sight and mind. 5. The conversion of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. When the Spirit makes thin the canvas, we see that the universe is a creation. Gwenol. The great Carthaginian theologian Tertullian wrote in about the year 208 concerning districts of the Britons, unreached by Romans, but subdued to Christ. There is a distinct probability that he was referring to Wales. Wales passed under Roman rule, but the country is mountainous and had a heroic tribal culture. Towns, such as they might have been, were few and far between. We know very little indeed about the Church in Wales until the time of Maxen Oleg. In 383, Magnus Maximus, Maxen Oleg, rebelled against the Emperor Gratian and defeated him. The emperor was then assassinated, and Maxen Oleg made himself the ruler of Britain, Gaul, and Spain. He invaded Italy, but was defeated and killed in 388. The monastic movement began in the Egyptian desert, had spread to the south of France by the end of the 4th century. Maxen Oleg and his wife Helena, both Christians, fell under the influence of a Hungarian ex-soldier, known to the world ever since as Saint Martin of Tours. Martin had been Bishop of Tours since 372, but he was also a monk and essentially the founder of Celtic monasticism. Until the time of Martin, the Christian faith had been confined to urban centers, but he saw the possibilities of the monastery as a tool of evangelical outreach among the Pagani, country folk, and exploited them to great effect. Tradition has it that, following the defeat and death of Maxen Oleg, his widow and her sons returned to her native Wales and established Martin's form of monasticism there. Dr. Kathleen Evans writes, "By the beginning of the 5th century, monasticism was well established in Wales, as is attested by the very large number of place names prefixed by Llan. The Llan, or Llana, was originally an enclosure, and the term was later applied to the monastic buildings within it. A monastery was generally known by the name of its founder or head as Llanbadarn, the Llan, or monastery of Padarn. The monks would begin by digging a ditch and throwing up a great bank of earth around their land. Within this they would build small huts or cells, one for each of the monks, with larger buildings for the church and refectory, and shelters for the animals. These huts would have double walls of wattles, with the space between filled in with earth and stones. Later they would be replaced by stone buildings, beginning with the church." The early Welsh Church. It was like a church to me. I entered it on soft foot, breath held like a cap in the hand. It was quiet. What God was there made himself felt, not listened to in clean colors. That brought a moistening of the eye, in movement of the wind over grass. R.S. Thomas. The Welsh tribal culture into which the Christian faith came was almost entirely rural. The 4th century diocese of St. David's, St. Asaph's, Bangor, and Llandaff each roughly covers the territory of one of the 4 main pre-Roman Celtic tribes. Creation being the image of its creator, the very land was holy and regarded as such, and not for nothing is the Welsh language regarded to this day as Iaith o Nefydd, the language of heaven. A monastery-based church was the ideal solution to the problem of evangelism and ecclesiastical authority in a culture in which cities did not exist, and territorial boundaries were always somewhat fluid. This caused the position of the bishop to differ somewhat from that of the continental church, and was to cause controversy at a later date, and not only in Wales. The head of the monastic community, like any of his monks, might or might not be in holy orders. Quite often he was a bishop. The great Welsh churchman Dyfed, 522 for instance, was head of a monastery and was in bishop's orders. Daughter communities came under the rule of the main community, which then might be referred to as an archmonastery, and in that sense its episcopal head was an archbishop. But the jurisdiction of a Welsh bishop was, for many centuries, congregational rather than territorial. It ideally suited the circumstances of the day, and slowly changed into a territorial jurisdiction as the culture itself began to change. Latin was the language of the early Welsh Church, and there is no evidence of the vernacular being used in the liturgy. The native language only came into very limited use much later, when the language of the Roman Empire, like the empire itself, became a dim folk memory. There was no significant liturgical difference between the churches of Wales and Gaul, but it was not until 768 that the Roman date of Easter was adopted. The marriage of clergy not in monastic vows was normal, and was the last of the differences in custom and discipline to be done away with. It was not until the year 1188, nearly 600 years after Augustine of Canterbury's ill-considered brush with the Celtic bishops, that the Welsh Church consented to come under the jurisdiction of Canterbury, and it was not until 1203 that the Diocese of St. David's complied, its bishop, Giraldus Cambriensis, holding out almost to the very end. The 6th and early 7th centuries were notable for the number of outstanding men and women produced by an evidently well-established and vigorous Welsh church. The 2 earliest and almost exact contemporaries were Dyfed, 522, born in Herefordshire, and Iltyd, 525, who was probably a native of Brittany. Both men were bishops and heads of monasteries. Dyfed, finally, of Ynys Enlli, Bardsey Island, and Iltyd of Llangwm Major. These 2 were the inspiration for a number of other great churchmen, among them David and Samson. David's father was Sant, king of Ceredigion, roughly modern Cardiganshire, and his mother, Non, is said to have been a nun. This suggests a style of Christian community which may not always have been celibate, but this is also a tradition concerning non-seduction by King Sant. David himself, an energetic founder of communities, followed a strictly ascetic way of life, dying at his monastery in what is now St. David's on the 1st of March, 589. Samson, Iltyd's other great pupil, performed most of his later work first in Cornwall, and then among the British immigrants in Brittany, where he died at his monastery of Dol on the 28th of July, 560. There were many others, roughly contemporary. Cadog, who died a martyr's death in Brittany, had spent some time with the church in Ireland, as had Sibi, the founder of the monastery at present-day Holyhead in Anglesey. Asaph, 596, had been a pupil of the Brito-Pictish Saint Kentigern of Mungo, Munghul, whose own last years were spent in a community on the site of the present-day Glasgow Cathedral. Asaph was to give his name to Kentigern's foundation at Llanwelly, and the Cathedral of St. Asaph's now stands on the spot. The Arthuriad. And holy Dubric spread his hands and spake, Reign ye, and live, and love, and make the world other, and may the Queen be one with thee, and all this order of the Table Round fulfill the boundaries purpose of their king. Alfred Lord Tennyson, The Coming of Arthur. Holy Dubric in Tennyson's The Coming of Arthur is none other than Dyfed, whom the Book of Llandaff describes as Archbishop of Llandaff. This he never was, nor did he ever crown Arthur as king. All this is heroically embroidered folk memory, gathered into some kind of unity by Geoffrey of Monmouth, 1154, Archdeacon of St. Thielos, and later Bishop of St. Asaph's. Geoffrey's Historia Brittonum, however doubtful as a work of history, is nevertheless something almost more important than a history. It is a mythology. It became a potent factor in the unification of England through its emphasis on the common origins of Britons, Saxons, and Normans, and it proved to be an inspiration for chroniclers and poets. It is to Wales that Britain owes, if not her soul, then certainly her fundamental archetypal images, and they are Celtic through and through. Logres, the archetypal Briton of the Arthurian cycle, is identifiable with the western half of England, with Cornwall and with Wales, and with the lowlands of Scotland up to the Clyde. The Arthuriad, for so it can rightly be called, became not only the treasure house of images and folk tales for the great mass of the populace up until the Reformation, it was also to a considerable degree what might be described as a lay spirituality. The Grail legends served to turn all normal values on their head and taught essentials of the faith in vivid popular form and with profound sacramental imagery. In this, the Arthuriad bears comparison with the great Eastern popular religious mythologies, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. The quest of the Holy Grail in the Arthurian cycle corresponds remarkably in function to the Bhagavad Gita in the Indian epic, the Mahabharata. Ninian and the early Pictish Church. Glen of the blue-eyed vigorous hawks, glen abounding in every harvest, glen of the ridged and pointed peaks, glen of blackberries and sloughs and apples, 14th century Irish. St. Martin of Tours was to be influential not only in the evangelization of Wales, but he was also to profoundly influence the spread of the Christian faith north, across Hadrian's abandoned wall, and into that part of Scotland inhabited by the Britons, and that most vigorous of people, the Picts. In 394, a Cumbrian Christian by the name of Ninian, circa 360 to 432, who had been educated in Rome, was consecrated bishop by Pope Siricius with a view to the conversion of Scotland to the faith. On his journey north, he came under the influence of Martin and determined upon a monastery-based approach to evangelism. He landed on the Isle of Whithorn in 397, and with his companions constructed the first stone-built church in Scotland. From his secure base, Ninian, his companions, and their successors ranged all over southern Scotland, as far north as Stirling and Perth, and also into Fife, and up the east coast a considerable distance. Some would claim as far as Orkney and the Shetlands. According to A.B. Scott, while a native ministry was being reared, the ministry of the church thus founded was supplied from the Mointiers, or religious communities of the Celtic Britons who lived south of the Wall of Antonine, and also from the religious communities of the Irish Picts, particularly from the overflowing community of the Picts of Ulster at Bangor, where St. Comgall the Great ruled as abb. Scott's reference to Irish Picts in Ulster no doubt concerns the P-Celtic minority, who were still as yet unabsorbed by the Q-Celtic majority. The monastery at Bangor was sending missionaries to the Picts until at least the 8th century, as witnessed the mission of Maroba, 722, who founded a monastery on the wild Applecross Peninsula. From this holy wilderness, Maurova's mission evangelized the Isle of Skye and penetrated as far north as Loch Broom. Scotland contained at least 4 distinct racial groups at this period. Most numerous were the Picts, who were to be found throughout the land, but who were under pressure from Britons in the southwest. A Brito-Pictish kingdom of Strathclyde, stretching from the Clyde to North Lancashire, survived until Norman times. Angles had invaded the southeast as far north as the Firth of Forth, and Celtic-speaking Irish had established an extension to the Ulster kingdom of Dalriada in Argyll and certain of the Isles. The Pictish nation continued dominant until the Viking attacks in the 9th century, and their church, like that of the Welsh, was organized monastically, with bishops in community holding a congregational rather than a territorial jurisdiction. To such a degree has Romanticism lighted upon the Celtic mission of Columba that the fact that the Pictish church founded by Ninian flourished for 500 years before it began to be merged with the Columban mission is almost universally forgotten. The incursions of the Scoti, or Irish Celtic speakers, into what we now call Scotland had already begun in the time of Ninian. Their progress east up the Great Glen was halted by the Pictish king Brud mac Malcolm, 584, whose capital was at Inverness. A very different Columban tradition from that usually accepted is cited by Scott when he claims, "It was into the Pictish dominions thus defined, and to this sovereign Brud mac Malcolm, that AD 563, Saints Comgall and Cannick, the Pictish ecclesiastical leaders, introduced St. Columba the Gael, outcast from the Gaels of Ireland, who had turned to the dispersed among the Picts of Argyll. Brut is presented as a Christian king, and Columba a refugee, seeking a remote isle in the west, from where he could minister to his own people on the west coast and in the Isles." Scott is a splendidly partisan historian who accuses the later Columbans of rewriting history in their own favor and to the disparagement of Ninian and the Pictish Church. Columcille's mission to Scotland. "Woe to the Picts to whom he will go east. He knew the thing that is. It gave him no pleasure that a Gael should reign in the east under the Picts." Prophecy of St. Berhan. The fearsome but yet immediately attractive figure of Columba, Columcille, arrived on the Isle of Iona in disputed circumstances in 563. According to his biographer Adamnan, he converted King Brud to the faith, and in 574 consecrated an Irish king, Aidan, to the throne of Dalriada. Like Ninian, he was believed to have converted vast areas single-handedly, but much of this is now believed to have been the work of his followers, or even of a near namesake, Colma Buchan. The Colman mission certainly penetrated into Perthshire, where a community was founded at Dull and another at Dunkeld. In 842, Kenneth mac Alpin, king of the Gaels, or Scots of Dalriada, seated himself on the throne of the Picts in Fortran, kingdom of Erin, and assumed the sovereignty. By this act, the kingship of the Gaelic colony of Dalriada became merged in the high kingship of Pictland. The foundations of Ninian and of Columba then merged, and the beginnings of a diocesan episcopacy can be traced with King Kenneth's appointment of Chulmac Argusso as first bishop of Fortran, the entire kingdom, abbot of Dwynkelyn, Dunkeld. St. Andrews in Fife became the religious capital after Dunkeld. The cult of St. Andrew was probably introduced into Scotland by the Northumbrian monks of Hexham, and Bishop Kelloc of St. Andrews appeared on the Mount Hill of Scone with King Constantine III in AD 906. He seems to have been regarded as bishop or chief bishop of all Scotland, Bishop of Alban. The four peoples of Scotland gradually united. When Malcolm III Canmore, Bighead, married the Wessex Princess Margaret in 1069, he took unto himself not only a much-loved wife, but also an acknowledged saint. Through her influence and that of the later House of Canmore, the Scottish Church was established, for good or for ill, in the normal continental Roman fashion. It was alas later destined to fall into a greater neglect and corruption than anywhere else in these islands, and the Reformation was to prove more extreme and more violent in Scotland than ever it was in England, Wales, or Ireland. It has been maintained that whereas St. John was the inspiration of the Celtic Church, St. Peter was that of the Roman. As J.D. Mackey comments, the Celtic Church gave love, the Roman Church gave law. The epigram is as true as most epigrams, though doubtless both churches gave both. The evangelization of Ireland. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness, of the Creator of creation. St. Patrick. Patrick, who with his parents and grandfather in Cumbria, we have already met, was kidnapped by Irish raiders at the age of 16 and taken into slavery, probably in what is now Mayo. After 6 years he escaped and eventually returned to his family, but found within himself a vocation to return to Ireland and begin the evangelization of that country. He studied in Gaul, was ordained deacon in Auxerre, and sent to assist Palladius, who was ministering to Irish Christians in Wicklow. On the death of Palladius, Patrick was consecrated bishop by Germanus of Auxerre, and proceeded to the court of the High King Lear of Tara. In spite of determined opposition from the Druids, he gained toleration for the faith and converted several of the royal household. Patrick's was not the only mission to Ireland. Many came from Britain and others from the continent, among whom were Secundius, Auxilius, Declan, and Tirnach. But Patrick's mission met with outstanding success, particularly in the northern half of the country. He died in 461, leaving a church served by secular clergy under a local bishop, very much in the continental style. Ireland had no towns, however, and the church soon adapted to the tribal organization of society, and assigned to each bishop a diocese coterminous with the Tuatha, a commitment to an extended family grouping that carried a great emotional charge. The bishop had the same status as the king of the Tuatha. Very soon the monastic life was established, as in other Celtic countries. The Irish social system laid great emphasis on kinship and personal rule, and readily welcomed the idea of the monastic family under its abbot. Tribal monasteries were soon founded, and there was an astonishing flowering of literacy and learning. Irish scholars were soon to be found as far afield as Russia, and the Holy Ireland of the Druids was transformed into the Holy Ireland of the Christian monks. It was a mere 102 years between the death of St. Patrick and the departure of Columcille, Columba, on his journey to Iona at the age of 42. So rapid and so profound had been Ireland's reception of the faith. But why and how? Frank Delaney, telling of his own boyhood, gives us an indication. At Mass on a Sunday morning in an Irish hillside church, the community took over. Though each individual worshiper was encouraged to contact God directly, all of us nonetheless belonged in communion, literally and figuratively. The mythology, whether Christian or pagan, or that vague and delicious brew of both, led us toward the stability created by belief. The system brought into play at the five senses, inculcation led towards communal harmony and moral coexistence. But at the basis, as the principal way and means, stood verbal communication. Narrative predominated. All the lessons taken from the higher authority, God or Jesus Christ, were transmitted as legend. Each and every Mass contained a gospel. The Celtic tales re-echoed. Christ the moral warrior. The lines between his divinity and humanity never became clear. His childhood in the house at Nazareth received full display. As in the Irish cycles, the childhood of Cuchulainn brought wondrous tales of silver hurley and golden ball. Lugh of the long arm could leap on a bubble without bursting it. Christ walked on water. The Christian Gospels were preceded in the Irish consciousness by legends such as the Finnan cycles, the stories of Finn MacCool. That vague and delicious brew of both led us into the stability created by belief. Christ was seen not only as the meaning and fulfillment of history, but also, more importantly, as the meaning and fulfillment of mythology. The Druids were not destroyed. They and their tradition were redeemed, transfigured, fulfilled. The whole person was addressed, the rational being and the intuitive being. And there being no taint of the Augustinian perversion of the faith into world rejection, its reception was as immediate as it was remarkable. Columcille's exile. He was born at Garton by his consent, and he was nursed at Kilnicknane, and the Son of Goodness was baptized at Tulachdules of God, St. Moira. On the 7th of December 521, Columcille was born at Gartan in Donegal. His father, Felmil, was descended from Conall Gulban, and so he was a prince of the northern Ineil. His mother, by later tradition, was descended from the kings of Leinster, and so Columcille's social rank was on a par with that of the High King. Columcille became a monk, and with spiritual zeal combined with social standing, he was a great founder of monasteries. The first was at Dwar-Columcille, Derry, and others followed. Columcille was in fact building up a parochia or parish of tribal monasteries, and while thus engaged in one of the southern Uirnell, Diarmid, was building up his own secular power base, until in 558 he felt powerful enough to proclaim himself High King in Tara, using the ancient pagan rites for the purpose. The Christianization of Ireland was too recent, and paganism still too powerful for this to go unchallenged. Columcille became involved in the mustering of the forces of the northern Uinnill, and the clash took place at the decisive Battle of Coldreve, near one of Columcille's monasteries, Drumcleve, at the foot of Ben Bulben. Diarmid suffered a crushing defeat. By the standards of the time, it was a bloody carnage, with some 3,000 dead. Columcille's involvement in the politics that led up to the battle was probably the reason for his exile, imposed or self-imposed, to Scotland, or in order to save as many souls for Christ as fell in the battle. For whatever reason, Columcille began the archetype for the Peregrini Christi, wanderers for Christ, the Irish missionaries who were to bring the gospel to parts of continental Europe over the next few centuries. 6. The Centuries of Sorrows. Here there were priests and bells, hymns and theology being read, choral song and music, praising the majesty of God. Useless and empty ruin, dwelling place with your ancient towers, many a storm and wind has lashed the bare tops of your walls. Sean O'Cullen. Almost exactly 200 years after the death of Columba, the Vikings raided the Columban foundation of Lindisfarne and burned its monastery to the ground. The following year it was the turn of Monkwearmouth to go up in flames, then Iona itself. From 794 until 836, the whole of the coastal areas of Scotland and northern England lived in an agony of terror. Nobody was safe, and nothing was sacred. After a brief respite, due to political turbulence in Norway, Harald Harfagr seized power, and a determined Viking expansion began into Scotland, northern England, and Ireland. The Scots kingdom of Dalriada was overrun. The Isles passed into Viking hands. The last was to be returned to Scotland in 1462, and one by one the Irish monasteries went up in flames. With the passage of time, Norse and Gael settled down to an uneasy peace. In Ireland, however, the Norse power was broken in 1014 by the High King Brian Boran at a decisive battle near Dublin. At the end of the century, an attempt was made by the warrior king Magnus Barefoot to re-establish Norse power, but he was ambushed, overwhelmed, and slain in 1103. Ireland was to enjoy 2.5 centuries of peace until the next onslaught upon her. During the 9th century, the Vikings broke the power of the Picts in Scotland, and possibly thus hastened the merging of the 4 nations of Scotland into one. In the west, the Viking kingdom of Man controlled all the Western Isles and some of the mainland coastal areas. In the 12th century, a dispute arose between Godred, king of Man, and his brother-in-law, Somerled, A naval battle in the Sound of Jura settled the matter, and the two divided the isles between them, Somerled taking all the isles south of Ardnamurchan, except the Isle of Man itself. Somerled was thus the first lord of the Isles, an independent Celtic island state for 400 years. It is interesting to note that Somerled, whose name establishes him as Viking, was whitewashed by his bards, and declared to have been the son of one Gillibrand, a supposed Celtic bane of all Norsemen. Be that as it may, two leading Scottish families, the MacDonalds and the MacDougals, very properly claimed descent from Somerled. Viking power in and around Scotland was finally broken at the Battle of Larg in 1263, by which time Norse and Gael had substantially merged into the one heroic tribal culture which was to survive in the Highlands and Islands until 1745. In England, Viking and Dane gradually took control of the eastern half of the country, thus repeating the earlier conquest pattern of the Anglo-Saxons. By the end of the 10th century, there was a considerable merging of cultures, and by the time of the Norman conquest, England was, to all intents and purposes, a single Christian nation, with Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Danish blood mingling by intermarriages. The British Celt on the English side of the Welsh border was by this time fast losing any separate identity. The coming of the Normans. The hall of Cundalin, it pierces me to see it without roof, without fire, my lord dead, myself alive. The chapels of Bassa have lost their rank, after the destruction by the English of Cundalin and Elfan of Powys. 9th century Welsh. The coming to England of William the Conqueror in 1066 brought a far more serious threat to the embattled Celts than any they had faced hitherto. The Normans themselves, descended from Viking invaders of France of an earlier generation, brought with them not only an insatiable lust for power and conquest, but also a political system utterly alien, not only to the Celts, but no less to the Anglo-Saxon. The feudal system replaced the strong ties of an extended family, the Irish Tua, with serfdom under a foreign tyrant in his stone-built castle. The feudal system soon enslaved the native English, and the Norman kings began to look further afield. King Henry II, 1154–89, prevailed upon the only Englishman ever to occupy the papal throne, Hadrian IV, to grant him the overlordship of Ireland, Ireland being irreligious and thus in need of Christian conquest, and the payment of more regular financial tribute to Rome. The papal bull which granted this honor, Laudabiliter, is now generally recognized to have been a forgery, but armed with such impeccable credentials, Henry II was quick to respond to an opportunity which arose almost 20 years later. A disgruntled king, Dermot MacMurrough of Leinster, sought assistance from Henry in seizing national power from his rivals. He might as well have asked the devil for assistance against sin. Two invasions, a year apart, established a precarious Norman-English lordship over Ireland, and the Synod of the Irish Church at Cashel in 1171 abolished the Celtic system of monastic, even tribal, episcopacy in favor of the continental system of bishops with territorial jurisdictions. The Synod of Cashel went further. It abolished Gaelic liturgies, re-established Latin as the liturgical language, where it had lapsed, and decreed that all services shall be celebrated according to the usage of the Church of England. Wales fought the Normans and their successors off and on for 300 years. Paradoxically, it was a mostly Welsh infantry, chiefly their archers, who won the battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt for the English in their 100 Years' War against the French. Scotland suffered from a determined attempt at conquest by Edward I, 1272–1307, but won her freedom, though not by any means her peace, at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. She was a divided nation, and would remain so until after 1745. The King's Writ ran south of the Highland line. Beyond lay the old heroic tribal culture of the clans, and their allegiance to the Scottish crown was decidedly conditional. The Gaelic language was spoken throughout in the countryside, although Scotch English, was latterly the language of officialdom. The central characteristics of Celtic Christianity. Bless to me, O God, the moon that is above me. Bless to me, O God, the earth that is beneath me. Bless to me, O God, my wife and my children. And bless, O God, myself, who have care of them. Bless to me my wife and my children, and bless, O God, myself, who have care of them. Carmina Gadelica. The political assaults upon the Celtic peoples, their culture, and their integrity were one thing. Their Christian faith was quite another. As always, it flowered in adversity. The characteristics of the Christian faith of the Celts were not peculiar to them, either then or now. They are, in fact, the essential wholeness of the Christian vision. They can be stated thus. 1. An intense awareness that the world, indeed the whole universe, is the transfigured image of God, charged at every point with His glory. Christ loved the earth, loved it as a lover, because it is God's earth. He loved it because it was created by His Father from nothingness to be life's temple. Donald Evans. 2. A vivid awareness of the risen Christ, glorious and beautiful, and yet humiliated still in the sufferings of the poor. There is no sense of gentle Jesus meek and mild, no sentimentality, but there is a great and mutual tenderness. 3. A clear vision of the whole Church, the organism rather than the organization, as immersed in and radiant with the oneness of the Trinity. St. John, beloved of the Celt, tells us that God is love. This is perhaps the Christian revelation in a nutshell. The realization that God is also a love affair sums up the doctrine of the Trinity in a nutshell. And about this there is no confusion in any of the Celtic writings or prayers. God is one and indivisible, but within the unity there is, blessedly but unimaginably, a Trinity. This is the Christian experience of God, and Christians are caught up in the love affair which is God. This is why Christ came, why the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The three who are over my head, the three who are under my tread, the three who are over me here, the three who are over me there, the three who are in the earth near, the three who are up in the air, the three who in heaven do dwell, the three in the great ocean swell, pervading three, O be with me. 4. Above all else, there is a passionate knowledge of the unutterable tenderness and mercy of God, the truth beyond every other truth. I see this one today coming towards me across Tircoch, beckoning with the hands that are warm with his own blood. I hear him call too, in the accents of Nant Conwy. Marion Evans. The coming of the Reformation. The compassing of God beyond thee, the compassing of the God of life, the compassing of Christ beyond thee, the compassing of the Christ of love, the compassing of Spirit beyond thee, the compassing of the Spirit of grace, the compassing of the three beyond thee, the compassing of the three preserve thee, the compassing of the three preserve thee. Carmina Gadelica. The first 1400 years of the Christian faith among the Celtic peoples saw their fair share of battle, murder, and sudden death. Gradually, the remaining paganism among their brother Celts was assimilated and fulfilled, and gradually those invaders who had settled among them were also brought into the one fold. The Normans who remained in Ireland, mostly in the Pale around Dublin, were rapidly becoming more Irish than the Irish. This was in spite of such monstrosities as the Statutes of Kilkenny, 1366, which forbade intermarriage, or even the admission of Irish musicians and storytellers to English households. An English subject heard speaking Irish was liable to have his lands confiscated. This was indicative of an English official state of mind, which was to persist for another 600 years. By the time of the Reformation, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, particularly north of the Highland line, were the main strongholds of the Celts. The old heroic tribal culture was still strong, and the common Christian faith, though officially subordinate to Rome, was remote enough from the continent to remain essentially indigenous. In England, it would probably be true to say that the character of the Church altered little until the coming of the Normans. Thereafter, it suited the kings of England to keep the papacy at arm's length. Celtic Christianity differed from English only inasmuch as the Celt differs from the Englishman, and lest this be overstated, it is good to remember that there remains not a little Celtic blood in English veins to this very day. The Renaissance and, hard on its heels, the Reformation constituted a profound assault upon the very soul of the Celtic people. One besetting weakness of the Celt is his tendency towards internecine strife. Another is his determination to see everything in terms of black or white, and neither to forget nor ever quite forgive. The Reformation in Scotland, where the Church had fallen into great corruption and decay, was thus a harrowing, bitter, and often brutal business. Calvinism was to become the religion of Scotland, and to claim the allegiance of most of its people. In England, reforming zeal joined forces both with rapacious royal greed and with the utmost administrative cynicism. The English Church, plundered and severed from Rome, but only moderately reformed, retained the allegiance of the great mass of the people, as did also the Church in Wales. In Ireland, the Reformation became a tool in the hands first of the Tudors, then of the Stuarts, Cromwell, and finally William of Orange. A fresh and sustained attempt was made over 2 whole centuries to conquer the country once and for all. The tribal culture was pinned down and finally destroyed by the settlement of an imported population, first of Northern English and later of Southern Scots. The imported population were of the Church of England, and the Church of Ireland was established almost entirely among the English in Ireland. The Scottish settlers brought Calvinism with them, and religious strife soon became a 3-way battle, for the great Celtic mass of the population clung steadfastly to the Church of their fathers. However, Anglican and Calvinist were at one politically, for all religious freedom and access to education were to be denied to Catholics until the very end of the 18th century. The Celts in general, and the Irish in particular, were thereafter to enjoy virtual subhuman status, and every effort was to be made at least until the time of Queen Victoria to destroy their culture, their languages, and their identity. The effects of the Reformation. The eye of the great God, the eye of the God of glory, the eye of the King of hosts, the eye of the King of the living, pouring upon us, at each time and season pouring upon us, gently and generously. Glory to thee, thou glorious Son. Glory to thee, the Son, face of the God of life. Carmina Gadelica. In an earlier chapter, we touched upon the distorting pessimism of St. Augustine of Hippo, his obsession with original sin, and an original guilt which he believed accompanied it. Sex he firmly and specifically identified with sin and world rejection, a doctrine of arbitrary predestination of some souls from heaven and the eternal condemnation of the rest, troubled the mind of this otherwise great, good, and saintly man. It also gained a certain currency in a Western church always slightly predisposed to receive it. While never the official teaching of the church, it was nevertheless respectable. Echoes of it were often heard, and international calamities such as the Black Death tended to bring such morbid but questionably biblical speculations back into mind. The Renaissance brought with it a rediscovery of Holy Scripture, and the invention of the printing press made it widely available. The Old Testament became a source of great, if uncritical, inspiration, and theocracies were set up by many of the early reformers, the most formidable of whom was John Calvin. Calvin was an extreme Augustinian. Mankind was totally depraved by the fall of Adam. All Augustine's darkest thoughts were to be found darker still in the mind of Calvin. Martin Luther was also an Augustinian, both in thought and in upbringing, for he had been a member of the Augustinian order. The mind of St. Augustine of Hippo inspired many of the doctrines of all the great reformers. It has to be said for them that their driving concern was for godliness in a church sunk in what must have seemed to them to be an irredeemable mess of corruption, power-seeking, money-grubbing, and worldliness. It is perhaps small wonder that the vivid images of the wrathful God of the Old Testament and the intellectual gloom of St. Augustine worked so mightily upon them. So utterly alien was all this to the Celtic Christian experience that the Reformation trauma must have been extreme. The Reformation was to a considerable degree a revolt by intellectuals. The focus of religion was effectively shifted from the heart to the head. In Scotland, popular education became a religious crusade, for the people must be enabled to read their Bibles and think for themselves. Not only was the intellectual climate essentially non-mystical, it speedily became positively anti-mystical. The intuition was suspect. It became regarded as the realm of the devil and his angels. In Scotland alone, over the course of 2.5 centuries, between 4,000 and 5,000 people were to be burned alive for a witchcraft which was as often as not little more than the possession and use of a higher than usual degree of intuitive perception. The consequences of the Reformation trauma, together with the political use of religious controversy, not to mention the importation into Ireland of a population alien in both race and understanding of their common Christian faith, are with us to this day. They constitute the shadow side of Celtic Christianity, which it would be as unrealistic to ignore as it would be dishonest. 7. Celtic, Catholic, or simply Orthodox? What shall we do with the pansy Christ who hangs high on the walls of the memory's vestries? We shall tear the petticoat that is about him so that we see the eternal arms, all hair and muscles, and the hands like shovels, whipping synods and government. Mary and Evans. But for the Reformation, nobody would be talking or speculating about Celtic Christianity. Such has been the conditioning of the past 4.5 centuries that, true or false, it is extremely difficult to avoid a sectarian interpretation of this remark. Nevertheless, the attempt must be made, for that cataclysmic upheaval of the Western Church, which goes by the name of the Reformation, was the consequence of two main factors. First was the sink of worldliness, corruption, and, latterly, fiendish cruelty, into which the papacy had fallen ever more deeply since Hildebrand, Pope Gregory VII, died 1085. By the early 14th century, merely to think for oneself was to risk being burned alive. Second was the renaissance of learning, the rediscovery of the classics, and the invention of the printing press. Set this in a Western Europe deeply traumatized by the Black Death and the threat of Turkish conquest, and all the spiritual, psychological, and intellectual ingredients were assembled for explosive rebellion against a thoroughly discredited status quo. The explosion, when it came, was cataclysmic and destructive, in a sense which is only now being fully appreciated. In the midst of this turmoil, and probably as a result of it, the morbid theological speculations of St. Augustine of Hippo flowered at their darkest in the mind of John Calvin, and only slightly less darkly in the minds of most of the other reformers. This we have noted in the last chapter. But Augustine was to find a new incarnation in the mind of Cornelius Otto Jansen, 1638, and Jansenism, though officially condemned by Rome, gained entry through a series of back doors and has imparted a somewhat Augustinian cast of mind to a great deal of the post-Reformation Roman Catholic Church ever since. In brief, Jansenism maintained that without a special gift of grace from God, the performance of his commandments is impossible for men and women. Furthermore, the operation of God's grace is irresistible, and thus mankind is the victim of either a natural or a supernatural determinism. This theological pessimism was expressed in a general harshness and moral rigorism. Indeed, a rigorous tendency in all matters of ecclesiastical discipline has characterized this movement from the first, as has a violent antagonism to liberalism in any shape or form, and particularly is manifested in the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. The Roman Catholic Church in Ireland, at least since its emancipation at the end of the 18th century, has manifested a decidedly Jansenist cast of mind. The dolors of St. Augustine's psychosexual problems and their rationalization in theological pessimism have thus been visited upon the Celtic Christian from both ecclesiastical directions in recent centuries. It is a matter of blessed astonishment that to a very large degree he has succeeded in transcending them. Reasons for a Celtic revival. More bitter to me than death coming between my teeth are the folk that will come after me. The elders who did God's will at the beginning of time were bare-haunched, scurvy, muddy. They were not stout and fat. The men of keen learning who served the King of the Sun did not molest boys or women. Their natures were pure. Scanty shirts, clumsy cloaks, hearts weary and piteous, short, rough shocks of hair, and very rough monastic rules. There will come after that the elders of the latter-day world, with plunder, with cattle, with mitres, with rings, with chessboards. I tell the seed of Adam the hypocrites will come. They will assume the shape of God, the slippery ones, the robbers. 12th century Irish. The Irishman who wrote of the elders of the end of the world lived at the time of the English invasion and the Synod of Cashel in 1171, at which the traditional Irish monastic episcopate was abolished in favor of continental-style episcopacy. With a wry black humor, he saw all the possibilities of future corruption, even then beginning to be manifested throughout the Western Church. The revived interest in Celtic Christianity springs in part from an awareness that the Church has become too much identified with worldly power structures, all claiming divine authority. This is the case, though differently manifested, on both sides of the Reformation divide. In addition, there is an awareness that the gospel has become altogether too academicized, and that the resulting primacy of intellect threatens not only equilibrium, but wholeness as well. The mainspring of the Celtic revival in this respect, however, is an urgent desire, however articulated, to recover a Christian faith that is big enough to embrace the totality of life's experience. Nothing less will do. Anything else is a distortion, a compromise, a counterfeit. There is an awakening to the realization that not only is the whole pessimism package associated with St. Augustine biblically questionable and evidently subjective, but that in terms of the life, character, and teachings of Christ, it is positively pathological. It is also attractive to, and has attracted, both the ecclesiastical rigorist and disciplinarian upon the one hand, and the Puritan and the hellfire preacher on the other, and for very similar, though usually unconscious reasons. The temptation to romanticize about the Celtic Church must, however, be resisted, and it is as well to be reminded that the elders who did God's will at the beginning of time were men of keen learning. Their natures were pure, hearts weary and piteous, and very rough monastic rules. There is nothing cozy or romantic about the authentic Christian revelation. Everlasting love is totally demanding, even to death. Anything else is a sentimental counterfeit. The contemplative life. Alone in my little hut without a human being in my company, dear has been the pilgrimage before going to meet death. A remote, hidden little cabin for forgiveness of my sins, a conscience upright and spotless before holy heaven. 8th century Irish. The Celtic Church depended upon its monastic communities, and those communities reflected the prevailing culture in that they were tribal both in character and in composition. Columcille set sail for Scotland in Iona with companions who were his own kinsmen in that they were his fellow tribesmen, but the monastery was the center of all evangelistic outreach. The whole life and work of the Celtic Church depended upon lives lived in contemplative prayer. All its activity proceeded from contemplation. In such circumstances, the mystical is normal. As Catherine Doherty puts it, There is a difference between what the East means by mystical and what the West means. I think the East would call normal many things that the West might think mystical. If you are in the desert and God knocks on your door and speaks to you, that doesn't sound mystical to me. It sounds quite normal. He said he would speak to us. Catherine Doherty, despite her Irish name, is Russian and was brought up within the whole ambiance of Russian spirituality. The Orthodox churches of the Christian East have not only been discovered by Western Christians in recent years, but have also begun to exert an influence altogether out of proportion to their numerical size in Western countries, and many who have looked longingly towards the Celtic past have been astonished to discover what they are looking for in contemporary Orthodoxy. In an earlier chapter, I mentioned my Polish friend, who had discovered during the war an unexpected possibility of communication between Gaelic-speaking Scots and Polish-speaking Poles. A warning was given against over-romantic speculation as to how and why. A not dissimilar warning must be given concerning apparent similarities between contemporary Orthodoxy and what we imagine the Celtic Church to have been like. Nevertheless, some likenesses may cautiously be discerned, for Eastern spirituality is in some important respects different from Western, and, just possibly, closer to the Celtic. To begin with, the writ of St. Augustine of Hippo has never run in the Eastern Church. The Christian East knows no monastic orders, each with its own style, its own rule, its own traditions, its own power structures, and its tendency to compete with other orders, in ways sometimes trivial, sometimes not. There are no Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, Carmelites, and all the very many other orders of both men and women. There are simply those in monastic vows. There are a number of degrees of solemnity in vows, and those in monastic vows usually live in monasteries. The commitment to a contemplative life and celibacy is what constitutes a monk or a nun, not the joining of a specific monastic order with its inevitably complicating loyalties to the order itself. In the Christian East, as once in the Celtic West, there is a tradition of retreat into the desert, Russian pustynia, to a solitary hermitage for a specified period, or sometimes for the rest of this life. Most of Catherine Doherty's description of pustynia and the pustyniki relates sufficiently to what we can find in descriptions of Celtic hermits and hermitages to be worth attending to in our present study. Usually the pustynik was a man, though there were women pustyniki also. Sometimes they were single people, sometimes they were widows and widowers. Not all of them were educated in the academic sense of the word. Whoever these people were, they were not necessarily old in age. Usually they were people who went into the pustynia around the age of 30 or 35. Others may have been older, in their late 50s or early 60s, who had been married, reared their children, and then felt the attraction of the desert. There was no big fuss about going into a pustynia. From some village, from some nobleman's house, from some merchant's house, from any part of our society in Russia, a man would arise. Of course, only God knows why he did arise. He would arise and go into the place, as the Russians say, where heaven meets earth, departing without any earthly goods, usually dressed in the normal dress of a pilgrim, to pray to God for his sins and the sins of the world, to atone, to fast, to live in poverty, and to enter the great silence of God. There were other pustyniki, both men and women, who had been monks and nuns. These people would get permission from their abbots or abbesses to become pustyniki, dwellers of the pustynia and the desert. This contemporary description of Russia, as Catherine remembered it from her childhood and from her knowledge of its traditions, relates strongly to such Celtic deserts as we know of from study and occasionally encounter in life. There is a timelessness about some of them which quite transcends the centuries. Catherine Doherty's descriptions ring true to me on more than one level, one of them being quite simply that of encounter. There is a tendency to dwell too much upon the sheer asceticism involved, and an Augustinian cast of mind can quite easily slip into putting a value on asceticism for asceticism's own sake. This is always an error. The rigors of early Celtic Christian life in any circumstances would seem ascetic beyond reason to the present-day comfortable suburb dweller. The asceticism of the Celtic hermit, as of his brother the Russian Pustinik, is better understood as the embracing of an absolute simplicity. Scanty shirts, clumsy cloaks, hearts weary and piteous, short, rough shocks of hair, and very rough monastic rules. Catherine Doherty, in the book quoted, was concerned to promote the desert as a vital part of the life of the busy, distracted Western Christian. We should all, in some way or another, have our own pustynia and enter its peace from time to time. This is the theme of her book. Once there, since the reason for entering the pustynia is one of listening to God in prayer and fasting, the first act of a pustynik is to fold the wings of his intellect and open the doors of his heart. The Russians would say, "Put your head into your heart and try to achieve a deep and profound silence." It is then, when one is deeply silent, that God begins to speak. Creator and creation is one. My Creator to visit me, my Lord, my King, my spirit to seek him in the eternal kingdom, where he is. 8th century Irish. As we have discovered, the influence of St. Augustine of Hippo has impinged upon the Celtic Christian from both ecclesiastical directions during the centuries since the Reformation. The Reformed tradition has been intellectualist and non-mystical, even anti-mystical. The intuition has been suspect, even identified with darkness. The Catholic tradition has been more fortunate. Even the Jansenist cast of mind, with all its rigorism, cannot deny or escape from the profound tradition of Christian mysticism, which the Western Church has always lovingly nurtured and rightly venerated. Anyone who reads the great Christian mystics will find all the sensitivities of the intuition very much present, set in the context of deep prayer and seen in a proper perspective. Within the embrace of the life and experience of the total Church, the various perceptive gifts of the faithful, and that whole realm known as the psychic, find their proper context, and also the way to their fulfillment. The faith does indeed embrace the totality of life's experience, as indeed it must, but the commandment is ever to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then all the rest will follow. The faith must also not only embrace, but be totally identified with, the whole of human life and the living of it. It is here that the Christianity of the Celt has triumphed over the limiting influences of post-Reformation ecclesiasticism of all kinds. There is a cost, however, and it must occasionally manifest in a schizoid separation of Kirk religion from the religion of the heart and of the hearth. This latter is well exemplified by a remark made by a Lochaber woman to her grandchildren, recorded by Alexander Carmichael in his Carmenica Delica. "Be still, children, be quiet. You would cause the mild Mary of grace to sin." The good woman was devoutly and sternly Protestant, and her easy familiarity with the Mother of God, common among the Gaels and belonging to her Celtic Christian inheritance, would have no place in the kirk she devoutly attended every Sunday. Essentially, the Celt is devout rather than religious, there being none of the unreal separation of religion from life and his inheritance. There is nothing to be religious about. Devotion, love, is his natural response to a total unity of experience of the loving Creator and the creation, which is the transfigured image of its Creator. It comes easily to the Celt to put his head in his heart. When the Celt becomes religious and manifests pious religiosity rather than devotion, then something is seriously and often horribly amiss. The interweaving of pagan legend and gospel truth. Go shorn and come woolly, bear the Beltane female lamb, be the lovely bride thee endowing, and the fair Mary thee sustaining, the fair Mary sustaining thee. Carmina Gadelica. In the 1526 edition of the English Sarum Missal, the summer and winter solstices, the spring and autumn equinoxes, and the passage of the sun through the zodiac rubbed shoulders with the feasts and fasts of Holy Church. Tactfully, the Church had baptized the old pagan feast. Omelk was celebrated as the feast of Saint Brede, who herself assimilated the pagan goddess of her name. Beltane became the feast of Saint Philip and Saint James. Ludsnag, the feast of Saint Peter's Chains, or Lammas, Loafmas, the first fruits of harvest, and Samhain, the feast of All Hallows. The winter solstice on the 21st of December was now the feast of Saint Thomas. The summer solstice on the 21st of June, belatedly on the 24th, became the nativity of Saint John the Baptist. The spring equinox, the 21st of March, was belatedly Lady Day on the 25th, and the autumn equinox was the feast of St. Matthew. In 1526, the slippage caused by the Julian calendar, then in use, showed the solstice and equinox dates as the 14th of December, 11th of March, 13th of June, and 14th of September, thus giving the Church's original game away. Our Lord, as he said, came not to destroy, but to fulfill, and all that was best and true in paganism was embraced and fulfilled. This is beautifully expressed in the Beltane blessing. Bless, O threefold true and bountiful, myself, my spouse, and my children, my tender children and their beloved mother at their head, on the fragrant plain, on the gay mountain shieling, on the fragrant plain, on the gay mountain shieling, everything within my dwelling or within my possession, all keen and crops, all flocks and corn, from Hallow Eve to Beltane Eve, with goodly progress and gentle blessing, from sea to sea and every river mouth, from wave to wave and base of waterfall. Carmina Gadelica. A feature of Celtic Christianity has always been the consecration of the landscape by the performance of stations. The setting up of great stone crosses and the consecration of ancient standing stones with the cross has from the first been a feature of the faith among the Celts. It continues the ancient wisdom out of its Old Testament into its New. The visiting of such places, crosses, wells, prominent or significant points of the landscape, and perambulating them 3 times clockwise, reciting the Credo, the Pater Noster, and the Ave Maria, still goes on and fulfills a deep need in the Celtic soul. Prayer done rather than merely said is deeply satisfying and has always been the spur to pilgrimages of all kinds. There is another side to this, however. Activity of this sort is part of the fulfillment of the priesthood of man, Christian man in particular. Mankind is priest to the whole of the natural order, articulating its praise to its Creator and representing both God to creation and creation to God. This is why the performance of stations is so curiously satisfying. Heaven and earth are at one in the hearts of the faithful. The saints, the holy angels, the well, and the man and woman at the well are bound together in a bond of love. The shelter of Mary Mother, be nigh my hand and feet, to go out to the well, and to bring me safely home, and to bring me safely home. May warrior Michael aid me, may Brede calm preserve me, may sweet Breenag give me light, and Mary pure be near me, and Mary pure be near me. Carmina Gadelica. With Catholic emancipation in Ireland, a tremendous program of church building was undertaken. There was a consequent movement of the Sunday Mass from stations in farm buildings and open-air mass rocks and such like expedients of persecution, and a consequent ecclesiasticizing of Irish devotional life, as R.F. Foster reports. From the 1850s, religious societies proliferated. Devotional aids and new devotions became the norm. The Rosary, 40 hours, perpetual adoration, novenas, blessed altars, Via Crucis, benediction, vespers, devotion to the Sacred Heart and to the Immaculate Conception, jubilees, triduums, pilgrimages, shrines, processions, and retreats. These tended to replace holy wells, bonfires, patterns, wakes, protective charms, effigies, and the ancient celebration of high points in the agricultural calendar. Contemporaries noticed the abandonment of magical practices in rural life from the late 1840s. One is tempted to wonder if as much was lost as was gained in this shift of devotional emphasis. Pagan legend and gospel truth are interwoven in Celtic devotion, and rightly so, for Christ is the meaning and fulfillment of all mythology, just as he is Lord of history. A rationalist mind, accustomed to living in prose and inclined to be dismissive of poetry, would find the genealogy of breeds superstitious, even dangerous. I readily confess that I find it delightful. The genealogy of the Holy Maiden Breed, radiant flame of gold, foster mother of Christ, Breed, the daughter of Dougal the Brown, son of Aeth, son of Arth, son of Con, son of Crerar, son of Keith, son of Carmack, son of Carin. Every day and every night that I say the genealogy of Breed, I shall not be killed, I shall not be harried, I shall not be put in cell, I shall not be wounded, neither shall Christ leave me in forgetfulness. No fire, no sun, no moon shall burn me, no lake, no water, nor sea shall drown me. No arrow of fairy, nor dart of fay shall wound me, and I, under the protection of my Holy Mary, and my gentle foster mother, is my beloved Breed, Carmina Gadelica. No less delightful is the charm of the yarrow. My hope is that all the Highland girls who breathed their girlish hopes over the smooth yarrow had their wishes fulfilled. I will pick the smooth yarrow, that my figure may be more elegant, that my lips may be warmer, that my voice may be more cheerful. May my voice be like a sunbeam. May my lips be like the juice of the strawberries. May I be an island in the sea. May I be a hill on the land. May I be a star when the moon wanes. May I be a staff to the weak one. I shall wound every man. No man shall wound me. 8. Celtic Christianity. So what? Thou King of moon and sun, thou King of stars beloved, thou thyself knowest our need, O thou merciful God of life. Carmina Gadelica. In his book Celtic Britain, Charles Thomas says of Celtic Britain and Ireland, those popular phrases, the Celtic Church and Celtic Christianity, must, in view of the universality of Christianity, be deplored as both misleading and inaccurate. In the introductory essay to A Celtic Miscellany, K.H. Jackson maintains that, since the time when Macpherson exploited Celtic sources to provide a public eager for romantic material with what they wanted, it has been the fashion to think of the Celtic mind as something mysterious, magical, filled with dark broodings over a mighty past, and the Irish, Welsh, and the rest as a people who by right of birth alone were in some strange way in direct contact with a mystical, supernatural twilight world, which they would rarely reveal to an outsider. Jackson is dismissive of the Celtic revival of the end of the 19th century, as also of the dim Celtic twilight, Yeats's term, of mournful, languishing, mysterious melancholy. He concludes, the Celtic literatures are about as little given to mysticism or sentimentality as it is possible to be. Their most outstanding characteristic is rather their astonishing power of imagination. It is good to be called to order, lest, in spite of periodic caveats, we conclude this brief study with a romanticism which sees only what it wants to see and hears only what it wants to hear. It is only fair, however, to remember that what Jackson calls mysticism is probably not what I mean by that very overworked and imprecise term, but rather what I would describe as false mysticism. In terms of Christian mysticism, very much a down-to-earth business, the Celtic writings are brim-full of it, as we have seen, and not a hint of falsehood or of sentimentality anywhere, or indeed of romanticism. To get to heaven, you have to keep your feet on the ground. It is in fact the astonishing power of the Celtic imagination which is the key to this, for the imagination is that faculty within us which produces images. The power of the Celtic imagination is witness to the blessed vitality of its interior life and of the healthy and uninhibited vigor of its intuition. God speaks through the intuitive faculty in the first instance, and the imagination clothes what is said in appropriate images, both for the purpose of our own reception of the communication, and also that it may be possible for us to communicate it to others. At this point, it will be helpful to introduce an important Christian insight, perhaps best articulated by St. Gregory Palamas, a mystic of the Eastern Church. It concerns the vital distinction between the essence of God and the energies of God, these terms being employed like any other theological terms, for want of better ones. Briefly, God is unimaginable, unknowable by mankind or any other created being in his essence. Of that nothing can be either said or known. But God is very much encountered and known in his energies. Everything we experience of God, everything revealed of God, everything in which God is known, as opposed to known about, relates to his energies and not to the unknowable essence. Thus the whole of creation derives from God's energies, and in those terms is the transfigured image of its Creator. Thus the Blessed Trinity, that eternal love affair which is God the Unity, is revealed to us through the divine energies. Of the divine essence we can only be silent. There is an Indian story about the sage pointing to the moon with his finger. The idiot looks only at the finger. All the creeds, doctrines, dogmas, and the rest, belonging to the Christian Church, are only pointing fingers. They can be no more, and it belongs to them to point faithfully and in truth. The very institution of the Church itself is but the sage pointing his finger. It remains depressingly true, however, that the idiot still looks only at the finger. 1,000 years before St. Gregory Palamas, the Palamite insight was shared vividly by the Celt. It may be that our fascination with our aboriginal origins derives from an uneasy feeling that, like the idiot, we have become preoccupied with the pointing finger and have omitted to notice that all it can do is point. In Celtic spirituality, we see eyes looking beyond the pointing finger. They invite us to look with them. And here we come to the correction of the very title of this book. It is not about Celtic Christianity at all, because there is no such thing. It is not about the Celtic Church either, because there never was one, separate and definable in such terms. It is about Celtic spirituality, and there is indeed something vitally different and distinct about that. The need for Celtic spirituality today. My walk this day with God, my walk this day with Christ, my walk this day with Spirit, the threefold all kindly. Ho, 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 the threefold all kindly. My shielding this day from ill, my shielding this night from harm. Ho, ho, both my soul and my body. Be by Father, by Son, by Holy Spirit, by Father, by Son, by Holy Spirit. Be the Father shielding me, be the Son shielding me, be the Spirit shielding me, as three and as one. Ho, 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 as three and as one. Kamna Korak. The Hebrew name Adam is derived from a similar word which means the dust of the earth. Thus humanity is to be understood, in biblical terms, as talking and thinking dust. In a world of ever more advanced technology, of frenetic mobility, and all the rest, it is very easy for present-day men, women, and their children to become almost entirely divorced from their proper context, which is the dust of the earth.